Welcome back. So today we're going to start talking about some of the bad ways of reasoning that people tend to fall into. I put these towards the beginning of the course, in part to kind of convince you that you need to take the course. Um, you may notice some of these ways of reasoning that you fall into, if you noticed other people fall into. You may be even sort of initially fooled by some of these arguments as I present them, right? When you first hear them, you'll think, seems perfectly good to me until I explain what's gone wrong with it. So this lecture and the next lecture will be focused on uh, bad ways of reasoning that humans reliably fall into. This first category of informal fallacies, these have been recognized for many years, maybe thousands of years, since people started studying argumentation. The next lecture on cognitive biases and heuristics will be bad forms of reasoning that we've kind of discovered in the last, I don't know, 50 years or so, um, as we've started to do psychological studies on how people reason. So we're beginning with the informal fallacies. So, as I said, fallacies are bad forms of inference. We talked about inference in the previous lecture. Inference is a way of going from knowledge to knowledge, right, or true beliefs to other beliefs, and we want uh, our inferences to go from truth to truth, right? We don't want to start with truth and end up with falsehoods in our brain. So fallacies are forms of argument that don't guarantee or don't even make it more likely than not that you'll end up with a true statement, even if you start with a true statement. Now, of course, there's a million ways that probably an infinite number of ways that reasoning can go wrong. We're not going to study every one of those. We don't have an infinite amount of time. So, for example, here's a bad inference, right? This might be a form of inference that you could conceivably use every time you have a statement, right? Just negate it and you produce a new statement, right? So if you start with the earth is round, right? Okay, just flip the valence of that and say the earth is not round, right? That's an inference, right? Uh, or it could go the other way around, right? If you started with the earth is not round, you could flip it and end up with the earth is round. That's a that is a form of inference, but it's not a great one. All it does is flip the truth value of whatever statement you started with. So if you start with a true statement, you'll end up with a false statement. If you start with a false statement, you'll end up with a true statement, right? Um, it's just not a reliable way to end up with truth, right? So you probably already knew that, right? You didn't need me to teach you that that's a bad form of inference. So the fallacies we're going to cover are patterns of inference that superficially look good that are in fact bad. And that's, that's where I can step in and say, these are ways of thinking that you may have been practicing yourself, right? Or people have been trying to sort of like convince you using these bad patterns of inference, and I can start to point them out to you so you can start to recognize them and avoid them. So one broad category of inference, so many of these have Latin names because, again, people have been studying them for so long that they started studying them back when Latin was the language of scholarship. So this is called ad hominem. It means to or from or about. Ad is kind of a general preposition in Latin, but hominem means the person, right? So about the person. So here's an argument. Uh, Barbara has argued that we should protect the rainforest, since she argues if we do not, then we'll be causing damage to the environment. But Barbara is dumber than a wooden hammer. So this is an argument, right? As in many arguments in everyday English, some of it is uh, contextual, right? Some of it is not explicit. Some of it is implicit. For example, an important part here that's implicit is the conclusion, right? They never quite say, the speaker, what we're supposed to conclude, right? Now, the last thing they say is something about Barbara, that she's dumb, right? But that's not the point of this argument. The point of the argument is not to convince us that Barbara is dumb, right? It's to convince us of something else. So what this person is trying to convince us of is that we should not believe Barbara, right? We should disagree with whatever Barbara is saying, right? So what's Barbara trying to convince us of? Well, Barbara's trying to convince us that we should protect the rainforest, right? So in saying that Barbara is dumb, implicitly, this person is saying we shouldn't believe Barbara and we shouldn't protect the rainforest, right? Now, it might seem that what could be wrong with that, right? If a dumb person is trying to make an argument, then maybe I should just believe the opposite of whatever this dumb person is trying to tell me, right? Now, we don't know for sure whether Barbara is dumb, and we don't know for sure that Barbara is making a good argument, right? Or that we should protect the rainforest. We're only looking right now at the structure of the argument, right? And the question is this a good way to argue? If someone tries to convince you of something, but we claim that person is dumb, even maybe they are dumb, does that mean that whatever they say must be wrong, right? And it feels convincing at first, right? We want to avoid believing dumb people, right? Um, but in fact, this is a fallacy. It's a fallacy of relevance, right? We call it a fallacy of relevance because um, the premises only appear to have something to do with conclusion, but actually what they're saying here is irrelevant. So the irrelevant part here is about the person, right? This person who disagrees with Barbara, right, and is trying to convince us to disagree with Barbara, um, is focusing on Barbara as a person instead of focusing on the argument that Barbara is making. So the person making an argument is, strictly speaking, irrelevant to whether the argument is good, right? So whose mouth it comes out of um, shouldn't matter, right? So I could probably train a sufficiently smart toddler to say the words, we should protect the rainforest, right? Does that mean that it's a bad argument because toddlers don't know what they're talking about? You know, if Satan himself came down and said, hey, we should protect the rainforest because it's coming from Satan, does it have to be a bad argument? Um, if Albert Einstein says the words, does that mean it's a good argument? Well, no, right? Um, sometimes, if you think someone is reliable, that can be a good heuristic for whether you should, believe their information or take it with a grain of salt. But that's only, again, that's just a heuristic, right? And a heuristic is just sort of a rule of thumb, right? We find it to be a nice, quick shortcut to say, okay, let's believe smart people and not believe dumb people. But a better way to analyze arguments is to look at the argument itself, right? And see if it's a good one or a bad one. So there are several forms of ad hominem. This one is called ad hominem abusive, right? So what it does is it ignores the argument that Barbara's making, right? So to make it clear, the argument that Barbara is making is she's trying to convince us we should protect the rainforest, and the reason she gives is we can damage the environment if we don't, right? So we can look at that argument and see if it's true, right? And see if the premises follow from, or the conclusion follows from the premises and all of that. Um, but what this person is doing instead is addressing something totally irrelevant, right? They're addressing Barbara herself instead of her argument, and they're just saying mean things about her. They're abusing her, right? So this is called ad hominem abusive, and it's a fallacy, right? It's a well-known fallacy. Instead of addressing the argument being made, you're just saying mean things about the person making the argument, right? But again, that's irrelevant to the argument itself. Here's another very common form of ad hominem. It's also got a Latin name called tu quoque. Um, so tu quoque means you too, right? So here's an example of a tu quoque argument. See if we can see what's wrong with this argument. Barbara has argued that we should protect the rainforest since, she argues, if we do not, we will be causing damage to the environment. Notice the beginning is exactly the same, right? Barbara hasn't changed, right? Barbara is standing there trying to convince us to protect the argument, sorry, to protect the environment. Sorry. Barbara is standing there arguing we should protect the rainforest, right? And the reason she gives us is if we don't, we'll damage the environment. Now, here is the different part. This person who is disagreeing with Barbara says, hey, you may not realize that Barbara drives a Hummer, which gets horrible gas mileage and causes a great deal of damage to the environment. So what this person has pointed out is that Barbara is a bit of a hypocrite, right? She's saying we don't want to damage the environment, and here she is running around damaging the environment with her car, right? So is this a good argument? Should we not believe Barbara since she's a hypocrite? So this is a tu quoque argument. It means you too, right? And this person is responding to Barbara by saying she's a hypocrite, right? She's not living up to her own um, beliefs, right, or her own claims. But again, actually, whether you're a hypocrite is irrelevant to your argument. Hypocrites can make good arguments, right? Um, Dumb people can sometimes make good arguments, right? So, and in fact, this one really hits home because look, all of us are hypocrites a little bit to some degree. We all know what's good and we can all give an argument about what we should be doing, but we're all a little weak, a little lazy sometimes. Everybody's a little bit of a hypocrite, right? That doesn't mean that your argument is bad or that you don't know right from wrong, right? It just means, we're weak. Humans are a little weak. So the fallacy here is also a fallacy of relevance, right? Um, Whether or not someone is a hypocrite is actually irrelevant to whether they're making a good argument, right? And this one is so common. I'm sure you could recognize examples of it in your own life, right? Someone says, "Hey, look at this mess you made. You really should clean it up. This place is becoming a pigsty." And you say, "Hey, well, what about you? Your laundry is all over the place, right?" Household arguments, arguments with partners and parents and um, children and spouses often devolve into this sort of tu quoque sort of thing, right? Um, and really, again, whether the other person is a slob is irrelevant, whether they're pointing out that you're being a slob, right? And that you shouldn't. Um, so that's tu quoque. So we have two, right, ad hominem so far, abusive and tu quoque. Uh, Here's another form of ad hominem circumstantial. So, just for convenience and sort of to make the differences clear, we're starting again with Barbara, right? Here's Barbara standing here making the same argument, right? She's saying, look, we should protect the rainforest because if we don't, there's going to be damage done to the environment. She has her conclusion, we should protect the rainforest. She has her reasons. Um, and this person, again, is pushing back against Barbara. And again, their conclusion, their point is, we shouldn't believe Barbara. We don't need to protect the rainforest. And the reasons they give is Barbara owns a logging company in Washington state, and she stands to make a lot of money if lumber supplies from the Amazon are cut off. Right? So what is this person doing here? They're pointing out that Barbara might have an ulterior motive for making the argument she makes. Right? Well, doesn't this seem convincing, right? If Barbara is stands to make a lot of money, right? If we protect the rainforest, then we shouldn't believe anything Barbara says, right? Well, no. Again, this is another form of fallacy, right? And it's a fallacy of relevance. They are not addressing Barbara's actual argument, right? Her reasons for saying we should protect the rainforest. Instead, they're looking at the circumstances of the speaker, saying, this person might have an ulterior motive. This person stands to benefit, right, if they convince us. And so they can, instead of addressing the speaker's argument, they address those circumstances. Right? But again, having an ulterior motive doesn't necessarily mean that the argument is a bad one, right? If you're a woman out there campaigning for, abortion rights or something like that, we typically don't say, oh, well, you have an ulterior motive, right? You're a woman, and so you could benefit. Like you might be able to have an abortion if we protect abortion rights. Well, yeah, sometimes people do campaign and argue for things that are in their interest, but they sometimes still make good arguments for that reason. If someone is out there, fighting for higher pay for, for workers or whatever, yeah, it's in their interest, but also they might have good arguments, right, for that. So just because something is in somebody's interest or they have an ulterior motive doesn't mean that the argument itself is bad. Now, it might be, right? Sometimes that might be a good clue to look more carefully at the argument, right? If you say, if a car salesman comes to you and says at the Toyota lot and says, "Hey, you want to buy a Toyota? It's got the best mileage, right? And it's the best value for the money. You need to buy a Toyota." Okay, they've made an argument for you there, and obviously they have an ulterior motive. They're going to make a commission if you buy the Toyota. It doesn't necessarily mean their argument is bad. Maybe the Toyota is a good car, right? Look at the argument itself, right, and ignore the circumstances of the speaker. So the next ad hominem is called ad hominem association. All right. So all of these have all been, similar fallacies in that they're focusing on the person instead of the argument. This is another way that people will commonly do that. So here's an example. Barbara has argued that we should protect the rainforest since, she argues, if we do not, then we will be causing damage to the environment. So that's her argument. This person now is trying to refute the argument by saying this. But my private investigator has just told me that Barbara has been secretly donating to fascist revolutionary groups in the area. If that doesn't discredit her position, I don't know what does. So this sort of argument is called ad hominem association. So it's not great if Barbara is, in fact, right, funding these sort of fascist organizations, but it's irrelevant to her argument about the rainforest, right? Um, if that's true of Barbara, then maybe I don't want to hang out with her, right? I certainly don't, necessarily agree with her politically, uh, but all that stuff is irrelevant to the argument about the rainforest and whether we should protect it and whether we are causing damage to the environment. Right? So hopefully you're picking up on the pattern at this point with these ad hominem arguments. The idea of ad hominem association is we're not suspecting her motives like we do with ad hominem circumstantial. Um, we're just saying Barbara, is associated with these bad things, so everything Barbara says must be bad, right, or must be wrong. Um, Again, it's irrelevant to the actual argument. Associating with bad people doesn't automatically mean that everything you say is false or that your arguments are bad. Okay, moving on from all the ad hominems, right? Again, we had abusive, we had circumstantial, right? We had association. Now we're moving another Latin word, right? Again, because these are old and they originated in the Latin. Ad populum. So this means to or for the person, right? So here's an example of an ad populum. You'll see them all the time in advertising. Over 30 million people own a Chevy. Don't you think they know something you don't? Here's another type of ad populum. You should join my golf club. It's the most exclusive club in the state. So what could be wrong with these arguments, right? If a lot of people are buying Chevys, then it must be a good thing to do, right? Or if it's a very exclusive golf club, it must be a really good one, right? Well, not necessarily, right? Definitely the form of the argument is something like, hey, other people do this, other people believe this, so should you, right? Um, but other people can be wrong, right? You meet enough people, you realize a lot of them are pretty dumb, right? So just because something is very popular doesn't mean that it's right, right? Or equivalently, just because something is very, exclusive or special or fancy doesn't necessarily mean it's good either, right? And these two different types of ad populum uh, have different names: bandwagoning and snobbery. So the first one with the Chevy, right? 30 million people own a Chevy. That's called bandwagoning because they say, look, everybody get on the bandwagon, right? Lots of people do this. It must be a good thing, right? Lots of people believe this. It must be true. Come along, get on the wagon. Snobbery is different. It says, oh, only very special people believe this. Only very special people do this. Therefore, it must be good, right? But in either case, with an ad populum, the idea is like just because other people do something doesn't mean that it's right, doesn't mean if they believe it, it's true. Okay, next fallacy. And I apologize, these early lectures, it kind of is just me giving you a long list of fallacies, right? So homework is meant to help you practice it. I understand cramming this all in your brain at once can be difficult. Making yourself a little cheat sheet can be nice. Practicing with the homework is helpful as well. Um, but that's kind of what this part of the course is. I'm just introducing you to a list of ways that people reason badly, right? And again, the point is to kind of convince you if any of these thoughts seemed appealing at first, or if you recognize yourself that you fall into any of these, then maybe you'll think, okay, I guess, yeah, I need this class. So this next fallacy is called straw man. And it goes something like this. Here's an example of a straw man. Mr. Coburn has been lobbying to allow alcohol to be served at certain locations on campus. But if the university subsidizes alcohol, the funds will have to come from somewhere, fees will have to be raised, and our fees are high enough. We should resist this proposal. So it's pretty subtle what's going on here. I've already telling you this is a fallacious argument, right? It's not a good reason to believe the conclusion. So first of all, what is the conclusion, right? To be able to analyze what's going on, you need to find the parts. Here the conclusion is we should resist this proposal, right? What proposal? Coburn's proposal to allow alcohol. So this person is against serving alcohol, right? They're saying we should resist Coburn. Um, Sometimes, if you're looking for the conclusion of an argument, there'll be an indicator. Sometimes people say therefore, right, or so. Here we didn't have that. I mean, it showed up last. Sometimes the conclusion shows up last, but sometimes the conclusion shows up first, right? Over this course, we'll have lots of practice trying to find the conclusion to an argument. So here it just happens to be the last sentence, right? And, you know, you'll get better at picking it out, but it's the thing that the speaker is trying to get you to believe, right? If you had to pick the one thing they want you to walk away believing, that's the conclusion. And here, what they want you to walk away believing is Coburn is wrong. We shouldn't serve alcohol on campus. Right? Okay, so what is the structure of this argument? Well, they describe uh, what Coburn says, right? Um, and then they do something very tricky and very subtle that you may not notice at first, right? Um, so it's called a straw man fallacy because what happens is instead of addressing your opponent's actual argument, you build a different argument out of straw, a weaker argument, right? And then you go knock down that argument, right? So you say, I don't want to fight the actual argument. That's too good. I'm going to get another opponent. I'm going to build myself a fake opponent and beat up on that opponent, right? So what's the real argument here? And then what's the straw argument that they're knocking down? Well, let's see. What does Coburn actually say? Coburn says we should serve alcohol at certain locations on campus, right? The rest, the next couple of sentences, are coming from Coburn's opponent, right? And the opponent says if the university subsidizes alcohol, funds will have to come from somewhere. Well, notice Coburn's original proposal didn't say anything about subsidizing the alcohol, right? Now, if you don't know what subsidize means, that'll make it extra tricky, right? But subsidize means to pay for, right? So Coburn is only arguing that we should allow alcohol to be served, right? Presumably it would make money, right? If you can serve beer and people are going to buy it, that would bring money into the university. The Coburn's opponent, right, saying something totally different that Coburn never said. Coburn never said that we should pay for the alcohol, right? So that's the straw man argument, right? And it's very tricky. Most people, I find, when they first look at this argument, don't notice that subtle shift, right? So again, instead of knocking down the real enemy, right, the argument that, yeah, let's sell beer on campus, they chose a different enemy. They said, um, I'm going to refute the argument that we should pay for alcohol to be on campus. Well, Coburn never said that in the first place. So in order to identify if you're dealing with a straw man, you have to be able to identify the original argument and then notice that a slightly different one is being addressed later, and it can be tricky. Again, here the move was from selling alcohol to subsidizing alcohol, different things entirely. Another type of argument that is often kind of easily confused with straw man is known as alternate description. So here's an example of a fallacy of alternate description. My ex-wife got mad at me yesterday because I took our daughter to Hooters, but the court said she has to let me spend time with her. How could spending time with her loving father be a bad thing? So if you don't know about Hooters or what are the, I mean, it's a restaurant where the waitresses are sort of scantily clad, right? So not a great place probably to bring a young kid, right? So what's going on in this argument? Well, this person's trying to make it seem like it was okay to do that, right? How are they doing that? This person's saying, look, I'm spending time with a kid. That's what I was supposed to do, right? Hanging out at Hooters counts as spending time with a kid, doesn't it? Isn't that a good thing, right? So what's going on here, right, is they're describing what they're doing, right? Just kind of describing their own argument or their own points in nicer sounding language, right? So it's sort of like straw man in that, you know, you've got one description of what's going on, then you've got a different one, right? Um, but there's some important differences from straw man. So in straw man, right, you're taking your opponent's argument and you're trying to make it sound worse. Here you're taking your own argument and you're trying to make it sound better by describing it in a different way. So again, the main difference here kind of lies in the target, whose argument you're talking about, and the accuracy, right? Are you making someone else's argument sound worse? That's a straw man. Are you trying to make your own argument sound better? That's alternate description. The other difference is straw man is a false way of characterizing the argument. Alternate description is technically accurate, right? This person was spending time with their daughter, but they just sort of ignored the fact that they were at a restaurant that wasn't really appropriate. All right, the next type of fallacy you may have heard of. It's pretty well known. It's called slippery slope. So here is an example of a slippery slope argument. If we approve the student council's proposal to allow the pub on campus to serve beer, then soon after other establishments will be serving beer. The students won't be able to turn around without someone selling them a drink. Our classes will be full of drunks. We should vote against this proposal. So let's pause for a moment, try to find the conclusion of this argument. Again, we don't have a big indicator like a therefore or a so that would tell us here comes the conclusion. The last sentence is a good place to look, although it's not always the last sentence. It can sometimes be the first sentence, right? But the last sentence here does seem kind of conclusion-y. It's telling you what to do. It says, we should vote against this proposal, right? That feels like the conclusion. And then, just from the overall context, they're describing someone else's proposal, right? They're saying what's wrong with it. And so they're saying that proposal is bad, we're against it. So the conclusion is we should vote against this proposal, all right? Okay, so what reasons are they giving you for that conclusion? Well, what they're doing here is they're trying to refute the original proposal to allow the pub to serve beer, right? And they're trying to refute that by showing that there will be bad consequences if we do that first thing, right? If we follow that proposal. Now, the tricky thing about slippery slope is sometimes this is a perfectly good form of argument, right? If, here's a similar argument. Hey, you really shouldn't drive drunk because if you drive drunk, you could get in an accident. And if you get in an accident, you could hurt someone and you could go to jail. Therefore, you shouldn't drive drunk. That's got the same structure as the slippery slope, but that's a perfectly good argument, right? Yeah, you probably shouldn't drive drunk because all those terrible things could happen, right? So the difference between a good argument and a slippery slope is how likely the consequences actually are, right? Um, and in this case, the consequences aren't really that likely. They seem sort of over the top, right? So again, the proposal is just let's serve beer on campus, right? And they say, well, if they serve beer at the pub, they might serve beer at other places, possibly, right? Maybe not, right? But okay, that's I guess reasonable. But then it starts to get pretty crazy. The students won't be able to turn around without someone selling them a drink. Well, that's not true. If it's the pub and maybe a couple restaurants selling beer, you could easily still, avoid beer. And then it gets even crazier. Our classes will be full of drunks. Well, these are all adults, right? They, for the most part, know that just because beer is available doesn't mean that they should be drunk all the time in class, right? So the consequences start to get pretty unlikely. And when you've got a series of unlikely consequences, you're dealing with a slippery slope argument. All right. Another fallacy, false cause. So here's two, similar arguments, right? I'll take one for each side of the political spectrum so as not to be biased, right? So, and these are just made up too, right? But number 12, the last time a Democrat was in office, the inflation rate increased dramatically. High interest rates are bad, so we better not elect a Democrat. Similar argument. The last time a Republican was in office, we got into a war. Wars are bad, so I'm voting Democrat. Right? So what's going on with these arguments? First of all, let's find the conclusions. Well, in the first argument, the conclusion is don't elect a Democrat. In the second argument, the conclusion is don't elect a Republican or vote for a Democrat, right? Since it's a two-party system, basically, not voting Republican is the same as voting Democrat. So in either case, they're trying to get you to vote a certain way, right? So what reasons do they give you here? Well, what they've given you is some correlations, right? They noticed two things happened at the same time. Now we notice correlations all the time, right? Maybe I work out on Mondays and Thursdays, and maybe I notice on both of those days I feel better, right? Okay, working out and feeling better have occurred together, regularly, right? Maybe every morning I leave the house on Wednesday and I notice the yard is wet, right? And it happens with regularity, right? Those are called correlations, right? When we see two things that tend to go together on a regular basis, we say those two things are correlated, right? Working out seems to be correlated with feeling good. Going out Wednesday in the morning seems to be correlated with wet grass. So correlations are very useful, right? If they are really regular, that means we can start to make predictions, right? Um, so if I notice the grass is wet every Wednesday, then I'm going to make sure I wear shoes, right, every day, every Wednesday, to make sure my feet don't get wet. But sometimes we take it a little extra leap, right? We start with a correlation, then we make a conclusion about a causal relationship, right? So if I notice that working out and feeling better or feeling good go together, I might start to think, oh, working out makes me feel good, right? I might decide, um, well, that now the grass thing is kind of tricky, right? Is it that Wednesdays are causing the grass to get wet, right? Or it can't be, right? That just it being the day Wednesday means the grass is wet, right? There's got to be something going on additional to that. Obviously, probably the sprinklers go off on Wednesday, right? But the important point is there, and you've probably heard this dictum in your life before, right? Correlation does not equal causation, right? Sometimes it suggests a causal relationship, but you have to do more work and more argumentation to show a causal relationship. A mere correlation is not always enough, right? So what happens in a false cause fallacy, right, is that a someone notes a correlation, right, and draws a causal relationship, right, concludes that there's a causal relationship um, only on the basis of a correlation, right? Um, Notice those arguments, right? So it was the last time there was a Democrat, there was inflation. Inflation is bad, so don't vote Democrat. So that might well be true. There might be a correlation. I mean, in fact, that was true. Like during the Biden administration, he was a Democrat, there was inflation, right? So that correlation does exist, but it's a fallacy because you can't just jump to causation. You can't assume that the fact that the Democrats in office caused the inflation. There's all sorts of other causes that could be going on, and to determine the cause is a much longer, more complicated process. Similarly with the Republican. So, yeah, there have been times when a Republican was in office and there was a war. Um, but if you want to conclude that the Republican being in office caused the war, you got a lot more work to do, right? Because there's lots of other possible causes for wars. Now, this person didn't use the word cause, right? They just said, better not vote Democrat or better not vote Republican, right? But the causal relationship was implied, right? Because if there's no actual causal connection between Democrats in office and inflation, then that wouldn't be a reason not to vote for a Democrat, right? So they're implying that there's a causal relation, even though they don't say it. So important to note, right, with false cause arguments, it's not just sample size. I mean, if you know, some of you may know a little bit about science, right, or about how we determine causal relationships. And part of it, you can't just cite sort of one day, first of all, one Democrat being in office and there being inflation is just too small of a sample to draw even really any sort of information about any regular correlation, right? That's a sample size of one, and that's just not enough, right? But it's not even sample size that is the core problem, right? You can have correlations with huge sample sizes, but it doesn't mean there's a causal relationship. For example, in all 5 billion cases studied, it has been determined that between the ages of 2 years and 5 years old, children's vocabulary gets larger as their shoe size increases. Therefore, if you want your child's vocabulary to increase, I recommend stretching their feet as much as you can. Right? Well, that's sort of a silly example, right? But notice, yeah, the sample size is huge, 5 billion cases, right? As children's feet get larger, their vocabulary gets larger, right? Very strong correlation. But of course, that doesn't mean there's a causal relationship. Obviously, the real causal factor there is that they're growing. And growing up causes your feet to get bigger, and it also, in humans, causes your vocabulary to get larger. So what's going on there is you have a common cause, right, that causes two things, and so they correlate because they're both caused by the same thing, development. Right? Number 15, and again, another huge sample size, right, but it doesn't mean that there's a causal relationship. So as part of a school project, I surveyed all the people in my hometown, and I found that all the people who take insulin injections have diabetes, and none of the people who don't take insulin have it. Well, I'm going to contact the FDA because obviously insulin is causing diabetes. I can't believe no one's discovered this yet. I'm going to be famous and save millions of lives. again, kind of a silly example, right? But here they're noticing the correlation, right? Oh, insulin injections and diabetics go together, right? But that doesn't mean that the causal relationship is that insulin causes diabetes, right? What's going on is the causal arrow actually goes the other way. Other way, having diabetes causes you to take insulin, right? Because you want to be healthy and it helps, it's a treatment for diabetes, right? So that's two ways, right, that false cause arguments often happen, right? You notice a correlation, but there's no causal relationship. There's a single cause that causes both, right? That's what happened in 14. In 15, they noticed a correlation, but they got the causal arrow wrong, right? They thought, oh, the insulin causes the diabetes, but in fact, it's the diabetes that causes the insulin taking behavior. So, I've already explained this part, right? In both of these examples, the correlations are very strong. There's definitely a correlation there. The sample sizes are huge, right? It's not just like one Democrat and there happened to be inflation, right? There's, yeah, definitely shoe size and vocabulary size are correlated, right? But you still can't jump to a causal claim, right? In the first case, there's a common cause, right? Child's growing causes both of those things to happen. In the other case, with diabetes and insulin, they got the causal arrow in the wrong direction. It's not that insulin causes diabetes, it's having diabetes causes you to take insulin, right? Um, so these are the informal fallacies that we're going to study. There's other ones we could go over, but the whole class is not going to be based on informal fallacies. It's a long enough list as it is. It's a bit of an information dump, I realize, right? So look at the homework. The homework is designed to help you practice these, and it's the same sort of thing you'll see on the quizzes, same sort of thing you'll see on the midterms and the finals. Is I will describe an argument, right? Somebody making an argument, and you'll have to say, oh, is there a fallacy going on? There might not always be a fallacy, right? Sometimes it might be a good argument, but you have to notice, oh, is there an argument going on? And if so, is there a fallacy going on? And if so, what fallacy are they committing, right? Um, and as you practice that, you'll start to be able to recognize them in real life, recognize them when you start to fall into trying to make them. I still fall into two quote ways all the time, right? When I'm, arguing with people that are close to me. It just happens, right? But at least I recognize it. Sometimes I catch myself. Or if somebody's trying to pull one of these on you, you'll start to recognize it if you practice it more and more. So, you might want to make yourself a little cheat sheet, list of all the fallacies. The lecture slides have them as well, and you can sort of jot down a quick summary, practice it with the homework, and hopefully you'll start to recognize these in life. And next lecture, we'll move on to the cognitive biases and heuristics. So